He was born cursed, destined to be a hero, yet unable to save a single soul. When dungeons tore open across the world, monsters flooded out with a ferocity humanity had never seen. The awakened gifted humans with extraordinary powers rose up to fight back, but even they weren't enough. The world was losing. Kim Sung-in carried the heaviest burden of all, the title of hero. From childhood, he was stripped of a normal life and crowned the last hope of mankind. No room for weakness, no room for loneliness. Not even his own mother would let him break, so he endured year after brutal year while everyone around him fell. Then came the day he stood alone, the last human alive, still swinging, because what else was there to do? After cutting down an endless wave of monsters, the Monster King himself appeared. He didn't attack right away. Instead, he looked at Kim with something almost like respect and offered him a place at his side. Kim refused. They fought, and for the first time in his life, Kim lost. Bleeding out on the ground, he let the despair wash over him. All that sacrifice, all that pain, for nothing. Then his eyes opened. He was sitting in front of a group of laughing teenagers, confused, disoriented, and completely out of place. Before he could process a single thing, one of them tried to hit the young hero, but his instincts kicked in. He instantly deflected the hand to the side. The boys couldn't understand what was happening, but it was too late. He dropped one of them and threw him aside. Everyone was shocked, while Sunjin, not realizing what was going on, immediately started apologizing. People began calling him Kim Soo-hyun, saying he was a total weirdo for doing that, and told each other they should leave because the police were coming. They told him not to come to school again, but he didn't understand because he thought his name was Kim Sung-gin, not Kim Soo-hyun. Of course, our hero stood up right away and pulled a phone out of his pocket. He thought it was so strange. Wasn't this his phone? It looked like 20 years had passed. And yet, when he looked at the phone's screen, he noticed his new face. At the same time, we learned that in the year 2042, the world had come to its end after dungeons started appearing all over the planet. Monsters began pouring out of these cleared dungeons, invading the real world. This event was called Outbreak, and it mercilessly destroyed everything on Earth. But on the other hand, there were people born with the power to fight this catastrophe. People around the world began calling them the Awakened, and Kim Sung-jin was one of them. Even after all humanity had perished, he was the last one standing, still fighting the monsters, becoming the final representative of mankind, the strongest awakened of all. At this point, he was at the police station, talking to an officer. The cop couldn't understand what was the name of the person sitting in front of him. He said his name was Kim Soo-hyun. At the same time, the police officer asked him about his date of birth and age, but of course, our character couldn't answer a single question. In that moment, the calendar caught his eye, and he noticed the year was 2022. So, if his memory served him right, time had gone back 20 years. He had no choice but to say he was 19, because in reality, he did look 19, and it was clear he was still in school. The cop asked if the person in front of him knew his home address. Again, there was no reply. As the officer grew frustrated, Soon-jin kept thinking he was certain he died at the hands of Fafnir. Was he dreaming? Or was this just one of Fafnir's spells? But then it became clear the feeling of that monster's grip on his body had been real. He truly was in the past now, but inside someone else's body. What would it take to return to his old one? There were too many things he couldn't, and might never, figure out. Of course, at this point, since none of his questions were being answered, the policeman said there was no reason to keep talking, and told him that his mother would be coming for him soon. He told him that once he left this place, he shouldn't wander around, he should just stay quietly at home. At that moment, the officer warned him about certain areas, but then suddenly, a woman's voice could be heard shouting, "Kim Soo-hyun." She immediately ran toward her son. It was obvious the mother was worried, her face full of fear and panic, but he couldn't understand what was happening. Right now, standing before him was the mother of the body he was in. By then, it was evening. The sun was setting on the horizon, and the mother asked if he had forgotten their new home address. Of course, they had just moved recently, but she couldn't imagine it would be that hard to remember. Maybe it was just the stress. Yet at the same time, she laughed because she never thought her son would talk to her in such a formal tone. Our character quickly caught on, realizing that in this new life, he'd be playing the role of the body's original owner, Kim Soo-hyun. But what was he supposed to say now, seeing his mother look so sad and defeated? Should he apologize? Then, the mother immediately handed him a tissue and said her son should just wipe his face a bit. She said she heard the kids who always bullied him had done it again today. When would they stop doing all this? She kept wiping her son's face and told him to let her know next time. She held her son's hand, which left Soo-hyun completely confused. Of course, at that moment, the mother didn't understand what was going on. Why was it suddenly so quiet outside? Soo-hyun noticed it too, and then, in that instant, a certain wolf was seen baring its fangs, while the mother kept walking ahead, unaware. She told him they should just keep going forward, but Soo-hyun looked back and saw the wolf. It lunged at him immediately, tearing a piece of his clothes, and several items fell from his backpack. It was clearly a werewolf. This was the very threat the officer had warned him about. He remembered that in 2022, monster outbreaks started happening far more often than before. The problem wasn't how to face the werewolves, but how to find proper weapons. Of course, the mother was frightened. She understood that monsters were right in front of them, but he told her to stay still. Armed only with an umbrella, he charged at the wolf, but the beast still struck. Since there were two of them, the second wolf attacked from behind. It was clear that the body our hero now inhabited was far too weak to handle such a creature. If only he were awakened. Another wolf was closing in, and he thought it was over for him, but in that moment, he saw his mother throw herself at one of the wolves. The beast hit the ground, but she was injured too. Why would she do that in the first place? It was reckless and dangerous beyond reason. Yet the only thing she said was that her son had to get out of there alive. Those words gave him no comfort. He couldn't even find words as the wolves loomed behind him. At the same time, a strange, sinister aura started radiating from Soo-hyun, making it clear to the werewolves that they might as well make their final wish. The wolves sensed something, and instantly began to flee. Soo-hyun ran after them, umbrella in hand, thinking he could take them down, but he fell right away. Was he really that weak? He rushed straight to his mother, lifted her onto his back, and told her they were going home. But the moment he carried her, he felt pain in his back again. He realized that ache was probably from the same injury as before, but as he thought more about it, he realized he didn't even know where their house was. By then, as night fell, he managed to find the address since it was written in the wallet. He placed his mother on the couch, panting heavily, but feeling a bit proud of himself. Yet at the same time, he heard his mother saying her son had to run away, that she would stay behind with the wolves. All of this was so upsetting to him. Why would she do that? How could she risk herself just to protect him? Then he looked at his hands, wondering why this body was so weak. Why was he so fragile that he couldn't even fend off a few ordinary monsters? Of course, he was furious that he'd been reborn into something so pitiful. Was it just to repeat all the same mistakes from his past life? Still, he decided to calm down. It was important to keep his composure in moments like these. But then, a strange glow suddenly appeared behind Soo-hyun's back. The system requested some kind of permission, then began user verification. Once the user was confirmed, the opening in the wall announced that the gate had been activated. Of course, it looked a lot like a certain abyss. What was this anyway? If an abyss gate had opened, it meant this body definitely possessed awakened abilities, meaning he could begin his journey just like in his previous life. He quickly looked down at his hands again, and realized that in 2022, during his old life, he had also started as a regular person. So that could only mean one thing. He could now enter the abyss far earlier than before. There was no reason to hesitate, so he stepped in, entering what was known as the Tower of Trials. The Tower of Trials, also called the Abyss. Once someone cleared the first floor, they earned the right to grow stronger. With every floor, your power gradually increased. That's why so many people entered, hoping to climb as high as possible. However, the tower had something even more important than its floors. At this stage, Soo-hyun was already heading into his first trial, knowing that the most crucial thing in the tower was the difficulty level, and that was exactly what he was about to choose. The key element was the floor's difficulty system. Naturally, the levels existed in parallel with the floors. Even though it was still the first floor, the higher the level, the stronger the enemies, and the stronger the enemies, the greater the rewards. Of course, that also meant higher danger. In short, the greater the risk, the greater the rewards. The tower shifted into a new zone resembling a coliseum. A level 1-0 trial had begun. But Soo-hyun wasn't sure if he could handle it because in his past life, he had only managed to master up to level 8. Still, he had to try something different this time to avoid rebuilding that same tragic ending. At that point, the system prompted him to choose a weapon. Once he made his choice, Soo-hyun knew he had to move forward as waves of monsters charged toward him. A few hours later, out on the street, a human was surrounded by werewolves, screaming for help, begging for someone to save him. And right then, Soo-hyun appeared, saying he'd found the same creatures that attacked him earlier that morning. Soo-hyun threw a few punches, finishing them all off with his umbrella. Seconds later, one of the werewolves collapsed, and he reminded everyone that he'd warned them he wouldn't let anyone get away with what they'd done. The werewolf trembled in fear, but Soo-hyun told him not to worry, because he'd be joining the others soon. At this point, we saw that the awakened Soo-hyun had cleared the first floor at difficulty level 10, gaining unbelievable power in the process. Meanwhile, the TV broadcast announced that recently, the number of gates had surpassed the number of dungeons that first appeared back in 2019 tripled. In fact, the sudden rise of dungeons had massive effects, sparking worldwide debate. Everyone needed to understand that the Tower of Trials and the dungeons were similar, yet took different forms. People began studying them through their phones. Of course, the Tower of Trials and the system itself had appeared almost simultaneously. No one knew what they really were, and the whole world was fascinated. Curiosity and desire for the unknown grew every day as people discovered more ways to harness energy from the resources found inside ethereal stones. Their prices skyrocketed. The rewards from dungeons became vital, not only for survival but also for the global economy. Awakened individuals earned instant financial rewards from clearing dungeons, driven by fame and the thrill of superiority that followed. Yet what people didn't realize was that, in some places, a phenomenon called the outbreak had begun to occur where monsters could escape from dungeons. Still, dungeons were considered overwhelmingly beneficial to society. The outbreak that was what shocked people in the future, because as dungeons expanded, stronger monsters began breaching into the real world. By the year 2028, the situation would reach its limit, and that catastrophe would destroy the world as we know it. By then, people were comparing each other's ranks, and for the first time, the name Kim Soo-hyun was heard ranked #1 in dungeon clears. They thought he was a rising star. So, who exactly was Soo-hyun? As soon as they said that, Soo-hyun stepped through the gate. He realized it had been a long time since he'd last been here, the Tower of Trials, the very place once known as the Abyss in his past life. It was a vast world where countless awakened gathered to explore the floors. Each floor was a separate world with its own environment, climate, and even culture. However, they all shared one rule. Before ascending to the next floor, you had to pass a trial. Now, all the awakened were on the second floor. Compared to the others, this one was full of accessible resources, but to use any of these comforts, one had to gather the required number of achievement points from the first floor. As soon as those words were said, we saw Soo-hyun slay another monster, completing his trial test. He couldn't believe it was even possible to handle level 10. Clearly, without the experience from his past life, things would have gone horribly wrong. Fortunately, the more Soo-hyun fought, the more the old sensations returned to him. At this rate, he'd definitely be able to reach the end this time. Once again, the system added an enormous amount of points, granting Soo-hyun the final score of first place. Of course, this was only level 10, yet the rewards were simply astonishing. Every one of his stats was growing much faster than before. He could now safely move on to the next floor with the points he currently had. He was thrilled by the massive total. Shouldn't he go shopping now? It was best to visit the store right in front of him. The moment he entered, he was greeted by an attractive elf who noticed that Soo-hyun had just climbed to this floor. She asked him to tell her whatever he wanted, and if there was anything specific, she could offer advice. She was a dark elf named Veli. He quickly realized that this merchant was the same one from his previous life, but her tricks wouldn't work on him this time. So, he immediately said he needed the transformation skill and the leap skill. Veli couldn't believe a young man like him knew about such things, but did he even have enough points for that? After all, those skills cost a fortune in achievement points. Yet Soo-hyun simply smiled and laid down 1,150 points on the table. She was speechless. What had he done to earn that many points? Veli said no one had ever scored over 1,000 points on the first floor before, but had he really reached the second floor already? Soo-hyun replied that of course he'd just arrived there, just a regular customer. As soon as Soo-hyun stepped out of the shop, he decided to look around a bit. Opening his dimensional bag, he saw he'd bought a sword, a spear, and all the other essentials. He hadn't forgotten a thing. At that moment, he pulled out 2 books and activated analysis. He understood that every skill required a certain level of mana control to master. Skills grew stronger the more you practiced them, but some had thresholds that couldn't be surpassed with skill alone. These were called growth-type skills, and they were extremely hard to obtain. Only one growth-type skill could be purchased within the Tower of Trials transformation. Another crucial factor was mastering the use of a mana catalyst. This catalyst would raise one's mana, level, and adapt to the user's abilities. It could also be bought from the regular reward shop after completing a challenge, serving as an item that boosts magical power to the desired level without climbing the tower or clearing dungeons. Soo-hyun thought it was easy to overlook something like this, but people missed out on so many useful things. The item in his hands was unbelievably valuable. Soo-hyun didn't know just how useful his memories from his past life would turn out to be, but choosing transformation and the mana catalyst was definitely a smart way to start. But while he was still thinking, someone approached him wanting to talk. Who was it? Why couldn't he sense his presence? For 3 seconds, the man stood completely still. Then he said he didn't want to scare him, but Soo-hyun recognized him immediately. He remembered that figure standing atop a mountain of corpses, smiling wide. It was Choi Hak-jun, the genius of the Abyss in the past, but also the main culprit behind the destruction of a major guild in the near future. Now, this man stood right before Soo-hyun, completely unaware. Why was Soo-hyun looking at him like that? But Soo-hyun simply said he was a little surprised. Of course, he had met him in the past. The man he remembered had a much more bloodthirsty aura. But what did he want to talk about, anyway? At this point, Hak-jun said he'd been following him since he was in the shop. He'd noticed Soo-hyun buying all kinds of different items and thought he had a good eye for equipment. Soo-hyun couldn't believe it. Had he really been tailed? At the same time, Hak-jun kept stretching out the conversation. He waited so long that Soo-hyun grew curious, though surprised when Hak-jun invited him to be in a party together. It was shocking he was acting like the kindest puppy, putting Soo-hyun in an awkward spot. By the time a new stage began on the 10th floor, Soo-hyun had already managed to escape with the treasure of the Charles clan. Soon, the members of the Charles clan would come after him to reclaim it. The mission: escape as fast as possible and survive in the forest. There were far too many lizardmen along the path to the forest, so Soo-hyun had no choice but to complete the mission in stealth. He understood that the Charles clan were expert monster hunters skilled at tracking their prey. Why did this quest have to be so hard? Once Soo-hyun looked at the necklace, he saw the inscription saying it had no special effects, so it was probably useless. I wonder what's the best way to pass this trial, he thought. The goal was to survive, so Soo-hyun came up with an idea right away. At one moment, he leaped toward a lone lizardman and took it down instantly. He realized that if he wanted to survive, he had to eliminate everything in this forest. Right then, a horde of lizardmen surrounded Soo-hyun. They charged at him, but Soo-hyun easily crushed them with his newly discovered power. Since the lizardmen were now moving in groups, there was a high chance the battle would drag on. It would have been far more profitable to come here with a team, but since the difficulty would rise after level 5, it'd be nearly impossible to recruit others to join. That's exactly what he discussed with Hakjun. He knew that level 8 was still too low for his goal and mission. As soon as he came out of his thoughts, the boss of that floor suddenly appeared before him. Soo-hyun had no choice but to use Leap and clearly declared that he would wipe out every member of their group. Within seconds, the boss was defeated like just another ordinary monster, and the system announced that the reward for the second floor of the Tower of Trials was the unique ability of the Charles clan's treasure. This necklace could now heal all damage and restore any stats affected during battle. It could be used 5 times. Of course, no one would have believed such a unique reward existed, but as Soo-hyun thought, destroying the monsters instead of running had been a good idea. Thanks to this trial, all his stats had grown several times faster than before, and with transformation, he could even predict how the boss would move. The unique ability of the Charles clan's boss was Berserker, a skill that increased physical strength relative to one's fatigue and remaining stamina. That would definitely come in handy in the future. Although he was exhausted, Soo-hyun managed to emerge from this fight in astonishing shape. If he kept growing at this pace, he'd surely be able to accomplish something great one day. Still, the system reminded him again about his fatigue, so he decided to think about it later. When he exited the dungeon, he went straight home and found that his mother had prepared an unbelievable number of dishes. She said it was because her son had saved her, but Soo-hyun told her she must be tired and should really take a break. His mother replied that she had no regrets when it came to her beloved son. Soo-hyun lowered his gaze to the table and immediately began eating. He was deeply grateful for this incredible chance. He knew that, even though he could never truly become her son, he would thank her today by eating every dish on that table, and someday, he'd protect her for real. At that moment, the news spread again that the second floor of the tower had been cleared by the top scorer Kim Soo-hyun. Everyone thought it was fake and demanded proof, but Soo-hyun knew this was bad news for him. He'd definitely have to hide now. Leaning back in his chair, he kept reading the comments. Many people even believed every guild would want to recruit him, which could be a huge problem. Meanwhile, in Seoul, one of the Ares Guild branches had also begun talking about Soo-hyun. Hakjun was there too, already familiar with the man in first place. He was told that he had awakened at the same time as Soo-hyun, but did he know anything about him? Hakjun thought for a moment and said he didn't think he'd met him before. Then the man said they'd postpone the matter and asked what was happening with the attack on the 3rd floor. He knew level 8 was extremely tough. Hakjun said he was looking for people to go with him, but given the volunteers' skill levels, it was almost impossible to find any. So, he decided he'd go alone. The man smiled and said that if Hakjun didn't have enough people, he'd find them for him so he should focus on climbing the tower. Then, something would happen that Hakjun already understood. The man's only request was, defeat Soo-hyun. In that moment, Hakjun knew that the man sitting before him couldn't possibly be Soo-hyun, and even if he was, Hakjun wouldn't know what to do about it. He figured it was better to focus on his own path. We shift again to Soo-hyun, who had already cleared the 3rd floor of the Tower of Trials, then the 4th, 5th, and so on. Even his final exam results had come out. His mother asked him to call her as soon as possible, but Soo-hyun went wherever he wanted to go, saying he'd return. By then, a whole year had passed. He'd been restless ever since finishing his exams, but still managed to clear the 9th floor. Then came the 10th floor, which would certainly take much longer. Since he didn't know how long it would take to finish it, the perfect choice was to take a break away from home. For the awakened who challenged the tower, the 10th floor is a barrier to overcome, as the difficulty spikes every 10 floors so much that it's even tougher than the 11th and 12th. That's why most players usually pick a lower difficulty than usual. But lowering it makes the following floors harder. So to pass this trial, one must absolutely become stronger. At this point, the information revealed that within a year, the Green Dungeon appearing in Anyang would cause a massive outbreak, the first time humanity would truly be under threat. And not long after that, an incident would strike Gyeonggi-do on New Year's Day. That was the future worth changing. By then, the sun was shining bright, and Soo-hyun decided that this time he would protect everyone, no matter what. The entrance to the 10th floor of the Tower of Trials stood before him. As he approached, an old man greeted him, saying he wasn't trying to stop anyone but would Soo-hyun spare him a coin before he went in. He was the gatekeeper of the 10th floor. Most people just walked past this beggar, but his role was actually incredibly important. Soo-hyun handed him as much as 5,000 points. The old man was stunned because the most ignored him completely and left, yet this young man was generous. Soo-hyun said right away that the old man was a very important person, so he didn't regret it at all. The man immediately thanked him for the kind words and asked, "Does he need any information?" Soo-hyun immediately asked for information about the 10th floor. At first, the old man thought this was all very valuable knowledge, but after receiving such a large payment, he couldn't refuse. So, at that moment, the old man warned Soo-hyun to be careful of the village chief. Soo-hyun wondered if that was all. He realized that if that was the case, so be it. He couldn't afford to doubt the gatekeeper's words. He stepped right into the portal, and when the system asked for a difficulty level, he instantly chose level 10. Now, he stood atop a mountain, looking down at a village. The system stated that it was necessary to find the target of this trial and deal with it, and that death was impossible. In front of us was a tower of challenges. A young girl was picking berries. Feeling lucky to have so many, she figured it wouldn't hurt to eat one. But the moment she placed a berry in her mouth, a terrifying creature lunged at her, jaws wide open. It was an enormous lizard, massive in size, so the girl had no choice but to run. She screamed in fear, unable to even form words. She wasn't expecting anyone to come save her, but just as she was about to lose hope, Soo-hyun rushed in, grabbed her, and told her to hold on tight. The lizard thought it had already eaten the girl, but it hadn't, because he had slashed it clean through. With a single strike, he'd taken it down. Once they landed, the girl was trembling uncontrollably, too scared to speak. Soo-hyun asked if she was okay, but she only shook in silence. Of course, after all that, he tried to bring her back to her parents, but they slammed the door in his face, shouting that he was trying to kidnap their daughter. Yet right after closing the door, the woman began saying that even if he had saved the girl, he must have had ulterior motives. Taking a child hostage wouldn't help. There was nothing worth stealing in this village. They told him to get out of their sight immediately. Soo-hyun couldn't understand any of it. He said maybe there'd been some kind of misunderstanding, but it was too late. To them, he was basically a kidnapper. But at that moment, the girl peeked through the window, looking at her savior. The system also stated that this village was worth saving because it was in danger. Soo-hyun understood that beyond this strange atmosphere, even the villagers themselves were hostile toward him. Clearly, this floor was different from the previous ones, so the 10th floor was definitely not as simple as it looked. The mission read, "Save the village and stay alive." Something completely out of the ordinary. He was sure there was more behind it. Where can I get more information? He thought. But the worst part was that everyone in the village was either spying on him or hiding in fear. They mimicked real people's behavior, but they were actually just copies. Standing in the middle of the street, Soo-hyun thought about how human they all seemed. It was as if these people were terrified of something, but what exactly? It felt like their world was about to end. For those who couldn't feel it, it wasn't easy to grasp, but Soo-hyun understood exactly what they were planning. He sat under a tree, realizing he simply needed to meet anyone with information so he could make progress. But he hadn't seen even an ant. Just as he was getting frustrated, the little girl he'd saved appeared from around the corner. He greeted her, and she quickly approached, offering him some of the berries in her hand before retreating behind the tree. She stayed quiet for a moment, then thanked her rescuer. Soo-hyun smiled and asked if she could come closer for a second. As she did, he pulled an incredible amount of food out of his bag, something the girl would surely want to eat. She thought she was unbelievably lucky. But, had the food in the village really run out? The girl immediately replied that everyone was scared of one another. Everyone just thought of themselves. Soo-hyun pointed out how tough things must be for the villagers. But the girl answered that they were still holding on thanks to the village chief, because he was their hero. Soo-hyun asked what she meant, and she simply repeated what her father had told her, that the chief worked hard to protect the village, and that everyone should trust and help him. After telling him all this, the girl asked why Soo-hyun had come to their village in the first place. Soo-hyun said he was just curious about the chief, and that he could help or at least share his enthusiasm. But then, the girl remembered the lizard and said those creatures couldn't attack the village, all thanks to the chief. Soo-hyun immediately asked her to tell him more about the whole situation, but right then, an old man appeared, asking what kind of stranger had come to their village. The man declared that he was the village chief. The gatekeeper's warning instantly echoed in Soo-hyun's mind. But the old man continued, saying he was sorry, yet right now, their village was in clear need of food, so handing it out like this could cause problems for Soo-hyun. The chief explained that he'd appreciate it if Soo-hyun stopped distributing food this way. And as soon as he finished speaking, Soo-hyun asked if he was truly the chief after all. This was the man he'd been looking for. Soo-hyun said he was just a traveler passing through the village, so if the chief would allow it, he'd like to stay for a few days. The chief asked him to listen for a moment, then immediately apologized, explaining that the villagers were afraid of wandering strangers. Soo-hyun could see he was still being cautious. Then the chief turned toward the little girl and asked if he hadn't told her not to take food without asking for permission. The girl quickly began to apologize, fear written all over her face, but Soo-hyun stepped forward, placed his hand gently on her head, and told her not to worry. He'd shared his food with her willingly, and he had no intention of harming the village. At that moment, Soo-hyun dropped a spatial bag on the ground, and the man instantly realized it was filled with an incredible amount of food. He said that if the chief allowed him to live in the village for a while, he'd share his food with them for the entire duration of his stay. Soo-hyun added that he could get more if needed, but the chief replied that this was enough, then asked him to follow, saying he'd let him stay in one of the vacant houses. As Soo-hyun walked behind the chief, he noticed a strange gathering in the village square where most of the people seemed to be heading. Many were praying. It looked like some kind of religious ritual. When the world is on the verge of destruction, people begin to lose their minds, each in their own way. Some hide behind masks of faith, others deny reality and start doing terrible things, and in the end, nothing remains. Soo-hyun initially thought no one was harming anyone, but the moment he looked closer, he noticed someone holding a dagger, declaring that they were about to sacrifice a corrupted soul. As soon as those words were spoken, the rope was cut, and the person sitting on the stage fell straight down. This shocked Soo-hyun. He realized that places like this were always the same, no matter what happened in them. As he left, the people began murmuring among themselves, saying they had to do this otherwise, the blessing of the gods would disappear. It was that divine blessing that allowed the village chief to possess his powers. They knew they needed to sacrifice someone within 3 days, and at that same moment, they all glanced behind them, realizing that the next sacrifice would likely be him. Later, the chief's assistant informed the old man that the ritual had been a success, but they hadn't found a new sacrifice yet. The old man immediately asked about the stranger who had come to their village, and the assistant said he hadn't done anything suspicious so far. But did the old man truly intend to use him as the sacrifice? The old man didn't deny it. He pulled out a small vial and said that the gods had sent him this way for that very purpose, and that the sleeping potion on his table would help them get rid of the stranger. Everyone had to understand one life meant nothing compared to the safety of the village. Did the assistant want villagers to die instead? At that point, it was revealed that a giant serpent monster lurked beneath the village, one that fed only on humans. Fortunately, this serpent kept other monsters from attacking, which was why the village was safe. The villagers lived in constant fear, never knowing when the beasts would strike. The old man believed there was only one thing he could do as the village chief to offer sacrifices, so he had no regrets. He was just doing what had to be done. 3 days later, the people brought Soo-hyun to that wooden altar. They apologized to him, saying it was all for the good of the village. At that same moment, the rope was cut again, and he began falling straight into the pit. By the time the old man entered the chamber, a full day had passed since they'd thrown him into the abyss. It seemed obvious that the serpent must have already devoured him, and it would all be over soon. However, when the old man stepped into the dungeon, he couldn't believe his eyes. The serpent had been carved into equal pieces. Soo-hyun asked what had brought him there. The old man couldn't comprehend what he meant. Had the man before him actually killed the monster? But Soo-hyun simply said that the old man was impressive, as if he didn't want the creature to die. The old man couldn't make sense of anything. He clenched his teeth and shouted that it was all for the village, that everything he'd done was for that reason. Yet as he said that, Soo-hyun asked, "In the end, wasn't it also for your own gain?" The old man froze, stunned by the question. Then Soo-hyun began to explain the serpent behind him, how it spent most of its time eating and sleeping like a sloth, building its nest and marking its territory, never leaving it. That was why weaker monsters never dared to enter the area, but that also meant that, to protect its nest, it had to be fed, and the main reason it didn't attack the feeder was because the one who fed it would never become its prey. The old man was horrified. He couldn't believe a single word, but Soo-hyun stepped closer, saying that maybe all of this was just an assumption, but with such precise knowledge, it seemed the old man had been pretending to be a hero, feeding the villagers to this monster. And at that moment, his hypocrisy reached its end. The serpent was defeated. At that moment, Soo-hyun appeared in the village square, holding the serpent's head, telling everyone the whole truth. The villagers couldn't believe that their chief had been lying to them. Of course, they had always thought it was just a sacred ritual, but they never imagined they'd been losing their loved ones because of it. Many were outraged, yet also terrified, believing that now the monsters would start attacking. What will Soo-hyun do now? But at the same time, he told them he'd help them all. The villagers didn't believe him and couldn't understand anything, so Soo-hyun said he would show them something right now. He revealed the serpent's eggs. The crowd was shocked, but he asked them to listen. He explained that this predatory serpent had one special trait: it always spared the one who fed it. So, with that in mind, they could raise the serpent's young safely. He told them not to worry, they wouldn't need to sacrifice humans anymore. The villagers began to calm down, but what were they supposed to do now? Soo-hyun said they would feed the serpents with other monsters, but who would hunt them? He said that at first, he'd help them all, but he was just a traveler, and he'd be leaving soon, so they'd have to learn to fend for themselves. Immediately, the villagers started shouting at him to stop talking nonsense. How could they possibly hunt monsters with nothing but farming tools? Soo-hyun then asked them a simple question. Isn't this your village? If it is, then you should be the ones protecting it. But if you'd rather not, you can just give up or start sacrificing your people again. The refusal to protect oneself, the constant reliance on others, that's what creates so-called heroes. But a weak hero born from someone else's will can never truly be a hero. Were his words too harsh? Maybe, but right when it seemed all hope was lost, they shouted that they'd do it. Even the little girl stood up and said that no matter how dangerous things were, she wanted to learn how to protect her loved ones. Soo-hyun told her she was doing great and that if everyone worked together, they'd definitely succeed. At that moment, the girl's eyes shone, and he turned to the crowd, saying that if even a child like her had the courage, then the rest of them had no excuse. One by one, the villagers began agreeing. The former assistant of the chief said that as long as the traveler was with them, they all wanted to learn how to manage things for the future. Then, the system announced that the villagers had gained the power of will, and the mission progress had risen to 60%. Still, Soo-hyun had no idea where to start. By that time, we saw the old man descending some stairs into a cave. He didn't like being humiliated by that traveler. He thought he'd destroy everyone now, because a flying beast stood before him. Meanwhile, many villagers were already learning how to hunt and gather food. They discovered that if they raised young monsters out in the open and kept feeding them, they wouldn't be attacked. They began to think this traveler was incredible, especially since, right now, he was fighting a massive creature all on his own, striking it with deadly precision. By then, night had fallen, and the villagers were calling for the traveler to come back. Soo-hyun said that as soon as he finished off the creature beneath him, they'd return right away. The system kept repeating that tower progress was now at 90%, but it wasn't clear why the bar wouldn't move any further. Soo-hyun wanted to wrap everything up quickly and move on, but just as he thought that, something strange erupted from the ground. The only creature capable of attacking their land had appeared, the holy bird of blue flame. Soo-hyun immediately realized this had to be the old man's doing. The old man believed that if the bird destroyed the village, everyone would see him as the true hero since he could supposedly control monsters. He shouted at the creature, claiming he had raised it, but the bird instantly unleashed its flames, burning the chief's body to ashes. Only Soo-hyun could sense the sheer power radiating from it. He decided to chase it, understanding it was heading straight for the village. He used leap, trying to get close, but the bird dodged every strike. Why couldn't he hit it? At that moment, he was blasted away by an attack. He was furious. He'd just managed to convince the villagers, and now this happened. The people were panicking, shouting in terror as Soo-hyun and the bird clashed mid-air. The holy bird was about to cast its spell, but at that same instant, Soo-hyun hurled his sword straight into it while covering his mouth from the flames. He realized that if he couldn't catch it, he had to try something simpler. At that point, the bird was bound, its power stolen, and Soo-hyun finished it off with its own fire. And then, silence. Somewhere else, his mom was on the phone, saying that he wanted to take a break after her final exams, so he was out of town. She wasn't worried, she felt sure he was fine, and that he'd somehow grown up a little. Sometimes, it even felt like he'd become a completely different person. We see a young man mid-battle, fighting a winged beast and doing it with everything he's got. Of course, there's a limit to the skill he can use. It's used through transformation, a growth-type skill whose power depends on its own level. Transformation can copy the physical attributes of a chosen target, and the number and difficulty of those targets increase with the skill's level. But this level wasn't enough to harm that creature at all. An attack came flying toward him. He tried to block it, but it was burning hot. He didn't want to die here. He'd been told to save the endangered village and survive. The necklace would be useful too, but he had to protect it. Soo-hyun remembered that. He needed to focus. He could still fight. He grabbed his necklace, his healing item. Every wound on his body closed instantly, with 4 out of 5 uses left. The bird flew off, and Soo-hyun soared after it, drawing his sword and plunging it straight into its back. The two of them crashed to the ground. The creature was dead. He had finally defeated it. Then we see someone shouting, and Soo-hyun shouting too. He was in a hospital, wounded. What a relief it was for those around him. They were thrilled he had finally woken up. The girl had thought he was dead. She saw him burning alive in those flames. Yes, he had lost consciousness, but what had happened? They told him to stay down and not move, because thanks to him, it was all over. That oversized bird was gone. They had cut its body apart, meaning they wouldn't need to worry about food for a while, and it was all thanks to the young man, just as he had promised. He couldn't believe it. Surviving that fire should have been impossible. He had a few bruises from the fall, but no serious wounds. Everyone looked at him joyfully. Hadn't his actions earned him the title of a hero? Maybe he was just lucky, but he was fine, aside from sore muscles. The girl ran up to him and hugged him. He earned 1,000 achievement points, and the highest reward in the tower's trials. The 10th floor hell cleared at 100%. Now, he had nothing to worry about. The villagers could live in peace again. Things were bound to get lively. Everyone was so grateful. He was their savior. People stood around his bed, vowing never to forget what he'd done for them. He couldn't believe he'd actually become their hero, but when it was time to leave, a teleportation gate opened on the wall. The girl ran toward him. Why was he leaving now? She was scared. Why was he going without saying anything? And what was that he left behind? Maybe he was going to save another village. Maybe he truly had to go. He was a bit confused. He wanted to leave quietly, but the girl was so thankful. She handed him a small bag, wishing him luck. She said that no matter where or when he went, they'd never forget him. Inside the bag were some fruits she had picked, snacks he could eat whenever he wanted. Her name was Melly. She thanked him again, and he said goodbye. Then we see a car driving down the road. A young man named Hakjun sat inside, staring out the window while another man spoke to him. The young man didn't respond. He seemed troubled. The man tilted his head slightly and asked if something was bothering him. He turned and said, "No, not at all," the man said. Of course. How could someone like him, the best among the beginners, be worried, having already reached the 15th floor? He was now at least rank B, and might even become one of the top-ranked players. It seemed they were talking about another newcomer. Soo-hyun's rank would be evaluated soon, too. Hakjun asked, "How do you know that?" The man said, "Just a hunch. After all, the kid just cleared the 10th floor, right? Isn't this the time for his evaluation?" He'd even been informed about which floors the boy had cleared. Hakjun said, "That Soo-hyun does everything to get your attention, trying to win your sympathy." But the man just added, "Either way, if you meet this boy, whether in the tower or the exam hall, bring him to our guild. If you recruit Soo-hyun, I'll let you go." The young man in the car understood what that meant. If this boy replaced him, he could finally be free. We then see a building, the Awakened Documentation Committee. The young man arrived there. He remembered the man telling him that once he finished, he'd set everything up for him to reach the top of the abyss. "You'd better hurry after the exam. If you think about anything else, remember that everyone will suffer because of it." The boy smiled and agreed. Now, standing before this building, he realized what a fool he'd been. As he stepped inside, there was Soo-hyun behind him. "Perfect timing," he said. "It's been a while since I registered my rank." The Awakened Documentation Committee was a government-run agency where awakened individuals could determine their rank, whether they were beginners or foreign awakened. They handled everyone. Many came here regularly. To enter a dungeon, one needed an official rank, and to earn money, one needed access to those dungeons. Even though Soo-hyun had only come to enter one, not to work, he still had to wait. Once registered, they became active awakened. Those with strong physiques and unique skills were officially recognized, and guilds often came here to recruit promising candidates. The attendant accompanying them said that once everything was ready, they'd tell him his name and details. A young man cursed from behind the counter, yelling at them to stop joking around and do their jobs properly, saying, "Let them check me again. I've got level 3 mana, it should guarantee me a rank C. Why'd they put me at D?" The man told him. The requirements for ranking suddenly changed, and those people can't do anything about it. The young man grabbed his neck and started shouting louder. "That's their problem if the rules changed. Why did he decide everything on his own and lower my rank?" Income from dungeons depended on one's rank, but even so, you couldn't just throw a tantrum over a grade you didn't like. Scouts were everywhere, and the argument was getting worse since the man refused to accept the results. Suddenly, Hakjun stepped forward, twisting the man's arm and throwing him to the floor. Are there still people who use such cheap tricks? Soo-hyun didn't quite understand what was happening, but then he noticed the man's bracelet. It was an artifact that temporarily boosted magical power, a rare item not sold in ordinary shops. Where had a player like him gotten such a thing? His rank was low, but he clearly had money. The man was still furious, but the young man didn't let go. Hakjun said, "Do you think the examiners here are idiots who only look at raw power? If that's the case, why didn't you take the test without that bracelet?" He laughed. "That's true, without it, you wouldn't even qualify for the lowest rank." "This is ridiculous." Security stepped in and dragged the man away. "I can walk on my own. Let me go," he yelled. The young man wasn't in the best mood either, and though he was worked up, still. Suddenly, someone greeted him from behind. He turned around and saw the boy he'd been searching for, the same one he had first seen on the 2nd floor. Soo-hyun asked, "Did he remember him?" Hakjun spoke in shock. That would be his first test. Soo-hyun asked, "Why was he so surprised?" Hakjun explained that, because normally, the rank evaluation was done a month after awakening. Soo-hyun replied that he wanted to avoid drawing everyone's attention, yet he couldn't keep his mother waiting any longer. As for the other young man, he'd be able to claim all the dungeon rewards once he passed his own test. Hakjun was already on the 15th floor but hadn't taken it yet. He's an odd one, Hakjun thought. They don't even know each other's names. That boy's name was Hakjun, member of the Heirs Guild. Just then, he was called up and ran as fast as he could. Soo-hyun remembered the guild that had been destroyed. It seemed that at this time, he had contacted them. Soo-hyun was locking an eye on that boy. Why did he do that? The report came in. His rank B, level 44. Rank confirmed. How could he have gotten such a high rank? He was still so young. Everyone was shocked. Soo-hyun congratulated him, though he didn't seem all that happy despite earning such a rank. Next up, Soo-hyun, the recluse, stepped forward. Everyone was surprised. This was the boy who had suddenly taken first place with a record-breaking score, the one whose 10th floor accomplishments everyone had been discussing. Hakjun was excited. He wanted to see this guy for himself. Soo-hyun beside him stood up, saying he'd be right back. Hakjun was stunned. That meant if he met Soo-hyun in the tower, or here, during the test, he'd have to bring him into the guild. If he succeeded, he'd finally be free. He thought, could this really be Soo-hyun? As it was, Soo-hyun walked up to the counter for rank verification. Later, when he came out of the building, he was frustrated it had gone terribly wrong. Just moments ago, when he stood there, he was told to channel his mana into the console, and he did, but suddenly, all of it surged out at once. What's wrong with his mana? They said. Still, something felt off, so they told him not to worry. Soo-hyun received a C rank, power level 29. That was simply impossible. Hakjun was shocked and thought, only a C rank. It should have been at least A or higher. People began talking about how two boys had the same name, but it was a common one, and no one really believed it was him. Maybe no one sensed it yet, but soon, they'd all receive the player records and awakening results, and they'd know. Because this person was indeed Soo-hyun. Then, Hakjun froze, or maybe he didn't. He wasn't even sure who was who anymore. The console showed his rank wasn't high, so perhaps Soo-hyun was mistaken. But he thought no one could perfectly control their rank or power level like that. Not even a prodigy. Only national-level awakened could do such a thing, and he wasn't one. As Soo-hyun walked away, he hoped, just for a moment, that they would all believe him. But it felt like he was losing control of his mana again. Thankfully, he managed to contain it, or things would have ended badly. Maybe it was just because his stats had increased so suddenly after clearing the 10th floor. Besides, the rewards were amazing, especially the skill he gained after defeating the Holy Bird, Divine Flame. It was a powerful growth-type skill, highly effective against demonic monsters, making it extremely useful. His stats rose a bit more, and he enjoyed browsing the shop more than anything else. The items there were impressive, since he'd cleared the 10th floor at difficulty level 10, but among all those tempting items, he'd bought one strange thing, an unknown sacred creature egg. He purchased it because it was the only item whose origin he didn't understand, and he was curious. Still, he was confused, not knowing what would hatch from it. There had been one case before where a lucky awakened picked up an egg and gained the power of a divine creature from it. He'd kept this one for a long time now, and nothing seemed to happen. Surely it couldn't be empty. As Soo-hyun was about to leave, someone called him from behind. It was Hakjun. He'd been in the restroom, so he was late. He asked how it went. Soo-hyun explained that everything was fine. He'd been given a C rank. Hakjun hoped his friend wouldn't mind him asking something, but suddenly, the man who'd been yelling inside cut them off. Soo-hyun thought he must be one of those guys, trying to get revenge. He remembered the bracelet. Out of nowhere, Hakjun apologized to him. He wanted to test his strength, and now said he'd take a look himself. But before anyone could move, the man was suddenly struck, as if electrocuted. A man was waiting for Hakjun. Why are you late? Hakjun stood there completely still, eyes cold and sharp, said guild leader. Soo-hyun froze in fear. It was Dong-young, the leader of Ares Guild. He walked toward Hakjun and said, "Don't call me that." The boy collapsed to the ground, bleeding and unconscious. The leader told Hakjun to address him as he. The man was furious, but, well, Hakjun just made a new friend. Hakjun tried to explain himself. I just met him in the training hall. I wanted to invite him to our guild if his rank was high enough. But the young man didn't think he could join. Dong-young said, if you're interested in him, there must be something special about him. I'll check him myself. Hakjun tried to stop the guild leader, but Dong-jung had already approached Soo-hyun. Hakjun motioned with his finger for him to stay quiet, but the boy introduced himself anyway. His name was Soo-hyun. Behind him, Hakjun was stunned, but the guildmaster didn't flinch. He was almost pleased. Hakjun tried to correct him. He's not the same player, he's rank C. That's definitely not the one we're looking for. The young man assessed the situation, but the guild leader silenced him. He made all the decisions here. He said, if Soo-hyun doesn't mind, let him show me his awakened ID. Sure enough, rank C. Dong-young relaxed. The resemblance had thrown him off. The names were too similar, he said. Well, if it had turned out to be him, I would have summoned him to headquarters. I don't have time for average players. He apologized for the inconvenience. If you're interested, come to our guild for an evaluation sometime, Soo-hyun replied. Even if I were that boy everyone's talking about, I'd never join you. The man looked shocked. Soo-hyun complete. If I join a guild whose leader doesn't value human life, what do you think will happen to me? There's already an example of what happens to those who challenge your members, isn't there? The man replied. Those people deserved punishment. Soo-hyun said. The player was low-ranked. Isn't that a bit much for self-defense? Dong-young thought. Clearly, he saw the world very differently. Among awakened players, there was an unspoken rule. No one interferes in battles between awakened, even if one of them dies. And the stronger the awakened, the higher their chances of escaping punishment. A guild with a leader that powerful could commit slaughter without consequence. Dong-jung said, didn't everyone want to join such a guild? Soo-hyun replied, yes. As he said, we think differently. They had nothing left to say. They left with Hakjun. Hakjun apologized to Soo-hyun and followed the leader, but as he walked away, Soo-hyun slipped him a note. If you ever need help, contact me anytime. He left with Dongyung, the Aries Guild's leader, an A-rank awakened. Later, Soo-hyun sat at his computer at home, researching the man's background. He had been a criminal known for fighting with his bare fists before awakening. When he awakened, he ended his crime spree and formed a guild, but loan sharking, human trafficking, and drug trades were remnants of his past. Aries was a dirty guild, people said, and the way Dongjung killed a man once proved it. They say people never really change. The young man was certain Dongjung was hiding something. He suspected that Hak-jun, the other player, also had something against him, but he couldn't quite figure it out yet. What exactly had happened between Hak-jun and the Aries Guild? He'd have to find out. There was still much to do, as snow began to fall outside. When the end came, the world itself seemed to freeze. There was no snow or rain anymore. The situation worsened with each passing day. At that time, he didn't realize that peace and quiet were luxuries too. It was supposed to be New Year's soon. He had almost forgotten, distracted by meeting Hak-jun at the exam. Now, he had another reason to return to the tower. It wasn't his rank that had made him stop climbing. It was the requirement to obtain an official Awakened certificate from the Awakened Committee in order to participate in raids. That's why he had to take the tests. He hadn't planned to rush, but he couldn't wait anymore, because he knew the incident was coming soon. But what if it didn't work out? Even if he qualified, he didn't let himself think about it. After all, he was the only C rank there. According to the database, he had no dungeon experience. Would they really choose someone like me for this? We see two people sitting in a cafe were saying, and Minseok, a C-rank hunter, level 12, expert at dungeon clearing. Lee Eunmi, a C-rank man, level 8, also skilled in dungeon clearing. And Kim Yoon, a C-rank healer, level 5 inches dungeon clears. Nothing seemed extraordinary, but the girl thought they worked well together. The man said, "These guys are just average-level players." The girl replied, "That's rude. I'm a candidate too," she added. Did they really care who joined the team? "We just need one more member," the man said. "Let's stay calm for now." One of them was Lee Juho, a B-rank awakened. "Even so, this won't work," he said. "We need at least one more participant." She frowned. "So, we'll earn less? Are you sure about that?" she asked. "He's already a high-level player. What's he afraid of?" he replied. "But safety comes first. You know how high dungeon mortality rates are, don't you?" He said that he stopped climbing the tower now, because he doesn't want to throw his life away. "What's the point if he dies in a dungeon? It's just an orange-class dungeon, no need to worry," she said, then added, "Let him do what he wants. I have to obey the leader anyway, so what can I do?" She reached out her hand. "There's someone useful here, isn't there?" "Luckily, we just received a request, and that person's name is Kim Soo-hyun. The easiest way to distinguish dungeon difficulty is by color. The closer it is to purple, the harder it is. An orange dungeon is the second easiest level. With a team full of C-rank awakened, they should have no trouble clearing it. But this orange dungeon was different. In the 1st of January, 2024, he was inside the dungeon, greeted, and awaited. He seemed to be the last to arrive, but that was fine. They had all come willingly. Officially welcoming him again was Juho, the leader of this team. He introduced the young man to the group. The blonde young man approached them and asked in surprise, "Isn't he the same Kim Soo-hyun, currently ranked first in the Tower of Trials?" Juho quickly clarified that he wasn't the two just shared the same name. This Soo-hyun was rank C, and it was his first time entering a dungeon. Soo-hyun understood everything but thought to himself, "It's a good thing I faked my rank. If everyone believes it, all the better. I shouldn't reveal my true skill here." One of the girls wanted to meet the real Kim Soo-hyun, but this was just a name coincidence. She looked disappointed. She walked toward them, wearing a bright red jacket, wondering if the boy was too young to participate or even useful at all. He said that he didn't think he needed to hear that from a hunter of the same rank. The girl grew angry, fuming that he dared to compare her to himself just because they shared a rank. "Let's calm down," Juho said sharply. "We're ready to move out. Do we really have enough energy to waste before entering the dungeon?" Then she added, "We'll see how nice this boy really is inside." Soo-hyun thought, what's the typical attitude of a third-tier rookie? The woman beside the red-haired one was Kim Barone, the leader's friend and assistant. Later, another girl approached him. She said her name was Kim Yin, and she would be the healer for their team. He greeted her politely. She told him not to worry too much about what had just happened. Some people just like to show off in front of other awakened. "I'm sure that girl didn't mean it that way," she said. If she didn't, he thought, then what did she mean? Either way, he told her he'd take care of her and asked everyone to look out for one another. "But who's that person standing over there?" he asked. The girl said she didn't really know, and it seemed even the leaders weren't sure who he was either. But since his rank had been verified, she was confident everything would be fine. Soo-hyun wasn't so sure. They were now about to enter the dungeon. There was a reason he had stopped climbing the tower and come here to this orange dungeon. The first reason, everyone here would soon die. On the 1st of January 2024, all members of this team were killed inside this dungeon. Strange events took place in what should have been a low-level zone. The case drew attention because 5 confirmed deaths were recorded, but at the same time, the report showed 6 members in the party, meaning the real killer had to be one of them. And now, with his joining, They were 7. That only meant one thing: the killer would have one more victim to choose from. To protect the others, he had to uncover the murderer among them. All right, what should I do? He thought while the rules were being explained. Suddenly, the leader paused and asked if he understood everything. Of course, he replied. There's nothing to worry about, it's just an orange-class dungeon, said the man. There won't even be monsters here. And even if there are, they'll be simple beasts like wolves. But then, something moved behind them. Juho turned and saw a massive, one-eyed creature swinging a club at them. Soo-hyun thought, a cyclops. Why? Why was a cyclops appearing in an orange dungeon? An explosion followed. No one could believe this was really an orange zone. The shockwave sent the group flying several meters. A cyclops in an orange dungeon. Something was definitely wrong here. They only appeared in yellow level and higher dungeons. This meant it was a growth-type dungeon. Just like transformation, a growth skill, there were dungeons that increased their level as you fought. That explained why it was harder than expected, but still, something didn't add up. Even criminals couldn't just alter a dungeon's difficulty. If their goal was simply to kill everyone, then this was exactly how to do it. But amid all the shocked faces, one person looked genuinely delighted. The red-haired girl screamed, saying they had to run. The dungeon rewards aren't worth our lives. How are we supposed to kill a monster like that? I'm out of here. If she left now, what would happen to the others? This wasn't the time to argue. The Cyclops attacked, none of them had time to react. The leader tried to block the blow. He wasn't lying about being a high-ranked player, but even he couldn't withstand a Cyclops. The B-rank awakened was smashed into a wall and knocked unconscious in a single strike. The rest froze in panic, and then everything lit up. What was that? It was Soo-hyun. He had charged straight at the monster. A girl rushed to the fallen leader, relieved he wasn't seriously injured. Meanwhile, Soo-hyun fought to defend himself from the beast's attacks. He punched back, dodging each swing as the Cyclops' massive fists shattered the ground. How long can we keep this up? He thought. They need to regroup. Even if they want to run, there's no escaping this fight. But there was no exit. The path was completely blocked. The masked man explained. Soo-hyun said, starting from yellow level, the entrance and exit function differently. Once you enter, you won't leave until you find the passage. Soo-hyun's right, said the leader. He didn't know why the dungeon's level had suddenly changed. Now we'll have to fight our way out of all these monsters. I'll take care of the Cyclops, but the rest are up to you. We need to regroup. There were about 30 monsters around them. Soo-hyun struck quickly aside from the Cyclops. The rest were still orange-tier creatures. Soo-hyun thought that he can leave them to the others. Normally, he could have wiped them all out instantly with his skill, but now wasn't the time. For them, it is time to focus on the main boss. The Cyclops' weak point wasn't its single eye, it was the hidden eye. Soo-hyun leapt into the air and landed on its hand. This eye right here, he muttered, then drove his strike straight into the Cyclops' palm. The reason it gripped its club so tightly was because of the eye embedded in its hand. The Cyclops didn't just attack, it also guarded that hidden eye with its weapon. The creature's fate was sealed. The others were still fighting. As Soo-hyun glanced their way, the leader shouted for him to watch out. The monster had grabbed him in its hand. He didn't even understand what was happening or how he wasn't already dead. It wasn't the same hand holding the weapon, this was the other one. The Cyclops crushed him in its massive grip. The red-haired girl screamed and said, "How could that arrogant kid die like this?" The leader yelled, "It's hopeless, everyone. Just run." But then wait. The monster's hand trembled, and suddenly the boy shot out like a bullet. It could have ended horribly, but he'd managed to break free thanks to transformation, the skill he had borrowed earlier. He landed on the ground, injuring the beast's arm in the process. So, raising the skill's level had been worth it after all. Patriarch Charles gave him the frenzy stat, and the divine bird had given him blue flame. Until now, he could only copy a target's abilities superficially, but now he could replicate their full power, far stronger than he imagined. Maybe I should see how far I can push this, he thought. As Juho ran up behind him, Soo-hyun was already soaring through the air again, cutting through the monsters in one sweeping motion, killing them all. Then he flew toward the Cyclops once more and said, "Where's it looking now?" He struck the monster straight in the head. His speed was unbelievable. The leader himself was astonished. There's no way these are C-rank abilities. But before he could complete his words, another creature attacked him too. He said, "We have to handle this together. What's done is done. Now, the men take point, the women provide support. Soxy and Yeon-si, remember your formation. Did you hear that? Stand firm," one of them called out. Soo-hyun watched as they started working together. That's right, he thought. It's time to end this. He smashed into the Cyclops' arm, then struck across its body. The beast disintegrated into nothing. They had barely managed to handle all the monsters. The girl thought she was going to die. She asked, "What do we do now? Even if we beat these things, we still don't know where the exit is. If more of them show up, nothing will change." "Shouldn't we call for backup from the higher-ups?" the leader asked. "Honestly," he admitted, "this is my first time in a situation like this too, and I doubt there are even protocols for something like it." He turned to Soo-hyun. "You okay, kid?" He wasn't injured, though his whole body still trembled. He said, It was an emergency, and I might have gone a bit overboard. We can have the healer patch him up, the leader said. In the meantime, I'll talk with this woman about what to do next. A girl ran to him, asking if he was badly hurt, but she wasn't even casting her healing magic yet. Anyway, she said, you fought incredibly well. Just think about it, you killed a Cyclops on your own. Even someone of my rank couldn't do that. I just got lucky, he replied. But why didn't he seem worried at all? The girl pointed out the dungeon's difficulty. She meant the others too, the cowardly boy terrified of dying, the mysterious masked man they knew nothing about, and those two affiliated with the Abyss Network who were gossiping behind their backs. They didn't even split dungeon rewards properly and always came up with pathetic excuses. Even if they cleared the dungeon somehow, they'd never get the proper payout. So that's what's going on here, Soo-hyun said calmly. Don't worry, I understand everything now. A man approached them, saying he wanted a word with Soo-hyun. We should step aside, he suggested. The girl was curious and agreed, and Soo-hyun himself wanted to ask a few questions anyway. The group passed through the cave. Luckily, the girl no longer saw any monsters. They had already cleared the ones from before. It looked safe until the next area. So, the woman asked, how did that talk between the man and Soo-hyun go? What was that plan? Soo-hyun wanted to ask something, he said, but the plan was cancelled. He thought about it, something there was more to come. The group soon arrived at a massive gate. They were so close, now the truth would soon be revealed. The heavy doors opened, leading into a vast, empty hall. It was gray and hollow, like the heart of the dungeon itself. Maybe the exit was here. The girl noticed several golden doors in the center of the dim chamber. Isn't that the way out? She asked. It finally looked like they might escape. Careful, the leader said. If you just run ahead like that. But before he could finish, a glowing message appeared before them. The dungeon system had activated. Welcome, challengers who have come this far. The dungeon trial will now begin. It was the voice of the tower system. The exit stood right before them, Soo-hyun thought. What was this? Starting from yellow-level dungeons, the raid no longer ended simply by defeating monsters. Just like the tower's trials, the raid could only be completed once specific conditions were met, for example, saving the village and surviving. The group had to choose how to proceed. Option 1, kill the monsters. The gate behind them would remain active for 30 minutes. Option 2, the opposite door would open, and they'd have to escape from the summoned monsters for 30 minutes. Those same monsters would chase them. You'll be expelled in 10 minutes if you don't open the gate yourselves, and the route will be chosen at random. Why does this system do whatever it wants? The girl shouted angrily. So they couldn't leave until they completed one of the choices. It seems we should pick the second option. The difficulty's too high, we can't fight them all. But the reward will be better if we fight. You all did well earlier, someone said. How can he say that? That kid's completely useless. The arguing started, but the red-haired girl cut them off. Stop fighting. Do we really have time for this? The leader turned away, avoiding Soo-hyun's eyes. The girl asked what they should do. With less than 10 minutes left, he was still thinking. The only reason we beat the Cyclops and made it here was because of him, the leader said. So maybe we should let him decide. What kind of C rank takes charge of a raid? Impressive. The red-jacketed girl grew furious. He fought and proved himself. He thinks it's better to fight. Who does he think he is after facing those monsters? She snapped. He just wants the best rewards. Soo-hyun said that. They could either run or fight. At first glance, escaping seemed easier, but if they thought about it, they'd still be hunted by those same monsters they couldn't beat. And fighting here, while risky, might actually be more profitable. If you think about it, that's probably the better choice, the leader decided. No one objected, so they agreed. Everyone lined up. The group formed a circle, covering each other's backs. They chose option 1, fight the monsters. Within 30 seconds, the battle began. The system wished the challengers good luck, and the gate opened. All kinds of monsters poured out, attacking from every direction. Everyone had to stay alert, a girl said nervously. Why are they so fast? A monster grabbed one man by the neck and snapped it. He couldn't even scream. But Soo-hyun stepped in and took the creature down. It only took a minute. They fought on. But what would they do next? Would they show their true strength or wait to see how things unfolded? As the chaos raged, they noticed something: the door. What was that? The healer girl was about to cry. The masked man stood outside the door with a blade in his chest. No one understood what had just happened. They had to stay focused. The wave wasn't over yet. They needed to keep fighting. But suddenly, the first route was forcibly closed. The second route will begin in 10 minutes. You must pass through the gate and reach the exit safely. The team didn't understand what was happening. They had less than 5 minutes left to finish the trial. Who opened the gate? The healer cried, and the others shouted in anger. No one knew who did it. Someone had opened it and fled. What a terrible person. Can we really defeat these monsters or not? Impossible, said the leader. As you just heard, they're stronger than the ones we fought before. And after that battle, we don't have enough health or mana to keep going. And if we run, there'll be traps. Don't worry, Soo-hyun said calmly. We should go. The girl shouted angrily. Don't you see these corpses? What is he thinking? Where is he going now? That's suicide, he said. We don't know anything about what the system meant by second route. It only said the summoned monsters would chase us. It never said there'd be traps, but we can see them. The system doesn't lie. Maybe they only trigger for people who abandon the chosen path. Everyone here has climbed the tower and cleared dungeons before, and you still don't get it? Think about it, if we stay here, we'll die in 3 minutes. Wouldn't it be better to at least try something before that? The leader rallied everyone, saying they should move out. If anyone disagrees, they can stay here, but I agree with Soo-hyun. It's our best chance. They could criticize his leadership later, but for now, the priority was survival, getting out alive. The team stayed quiet at first. Then, one of the girls nodded. It'll be better if we all go together. We have to hurry, we don't have much time. If they left, the doors would seal shut. The girl asked Soo-hyun if he was coming with them. He said he'd stay. She said, "Why would you stay here? Are you insane? You plan to fight the monsters alone?" "Of course not," he said. "I'll take someone with me for their sake, right? I'll take Yoon." But she refused. "I want to leave. Why do I have to stay with him?" As she protested, the leader closed the door, and she couldn't get out. She didn't understand what Soo-hyun was doing. "I'll explain everything to her later," Soo-hyun said. She screamed after them, begging to be taken along, but the leader didn't look back. He remembered everything. Her voice echoed behind the closed doors until she fell to her knees, sobbing. Soo-hyun said that, since she wanted to live, maybe she'll admit it once that dagger is out of her hand. "You think I didn't realize you're part of the Dump Guild?" Soo-hyun tore her sleeve, revealing the mark. "The worst criminal syndicate there is. The Dump's a den of murderers, a deranged cult of killers. They'll spread even more chaos later on. Right now, their name isn't widely known, but within 2 years, they'll become a group that threatens humanity itself. Their organization will be behind a terrorist attack. If I'm going to save the world, I have to wipe them out before that happens." The girl had planned to kill the entire party to earn the achievement her guild demanded. She was clever, antisocial, and obsessed with her own survival, constantly thinking of ways to flee the battlefield. Soo-hyun wanted to finish the dungeon, but his current abilities weren't enough to take out everyone. The mysterious one who hid his identity was naturally the most suspicious, which was why she chose him as her first target. She had deliberately spread rumors to make the others doubt their leaders. That's how he caught on to her plan. But the girl had already noticed him back when he was fighting the Cyclops. He's pretending to be someone else, she thought. He's Soo-hyun from the rankings. Then what's the point of killing him if he'll die surrounded by monsters anyway? She opened the gate and fled. The girl possessed a stealth ability, unique to certain healer classes, skills meant for assassination. She used it to hide from him and unlock the second trial gate. The path for the second test was activated. She wished him luck and vanished. "I wonder if her skill can hide the scent of blood pouring from her body," he murmured. She glanced at her arm. It was soaked in red. "When did he cut me?" The monsters smelled the blood and swarmed toward her. Now it was time to deal with them, the towering cyclopes and other beasts. Soo-hyun faced them all head-on, with sharp precision. "Sorry," he said quietly, "but you're all leaving here alive." He blocked one monster's strike, then another, and another, using every ounce of his skill. Flying creatures swarmed in, endless in number. "Good," he thought. "This is the perfect moment for the right technique. I'll finish this in one blow." Meanwhile, in the cavern, the rest of the team was running for their lives. Juho shouted, "Don't stop. The monsters will catch you instantly." A girl said, "So this healer, the girl had tried to kill him with a trap. How did the leader know?" Juho replied that he'd been told beforehand. Soo-hyun had warned him. The leader understood that Soo-hyun's true rank was higher than he'd admitted. He'd told the girl, "He's strong enough to take down a Cyclops alone." The leader suspected he was the rumored prodigy himself. He told him, "If that's true, then I'm asking you to take command of this raid. You're more suited to lead than I am." Soo-hyun had refused. "You're the one who should lead." He admired how the man had protected everyone when they were in danger, how he'd stayed calm and willing to sacrifice himself. "You're a real leader. More than any hero, you're the one who deserves that role. So listen to my request," he said. "Our raid group will face a murder case." The leader was stunned. "I'll explain briefly," Soo-hyun continued. "But promise me you'll get everyone else out safely, except me. Promise me you'll let me stay behind. I came here to catch the criminal." The strongest beginner in the abyss, Soo-hyun. He probably thought he could buy time with his strength if he stayed behind. Even if he can, what about all the other monsters? The leader thought as he ran. "But I have to end this." He wanted to go back, but he knew he couldn't do anything to help. Still, his heart wouldn't let him go. "No matter how I look at it, I can't just abandon him." He spun around and dashed back the way he came. He apologized silently to the others he couldn't lead them out. "I'll return and help him." When he opened the gate, he saw the corpses of monsters everywhere. But what was happening? Everything around him glowed blue. Soo-hyun was surrounded by divine fire. As Soo-hyun ran forward, he spotted the man and redirected his power, hurling it toward the remaining monsters and obliterating them. The leader cursed he'd come back. Soo-hyun shouted at him to leave. Juho said, "I couldn't just abandon you. What about the girl?" Soo-hyun answered, "She's taken care of, or rather, the monsters killed her." The leader had sprinted back like a madman, but by the time he arrived, Soo-hyun had already wiped everything out. There was nothing left to help with. "But you can still help," Soo-hyun said, because this is only the beginning. A yellow circle opened before them. A skeletal figure began climbing out of it. The final boss had arrived. A skeleton draped in a tattered cloak, wielding a sword, and bearing a glowing yellow mark on its forehead. The leader had never seen anything like it. "What the hell is that?" Soo-hyun stepped forward. "That," he said, "is the final boss of this dungeon. There are dungeons where the bosses are skeletons." The skeleton grew furious and demanded that Soo-hyun stop calling him that so rudely. To everyone's surprise, the skeleton could speak, and he preferred to be addressed properly, not insulted with a crude title like skeleton. "That's right," it said. "You shall call me the Lich, the Dark Priest. That is my true name." Before he could finish his grand introduction, Soo-hyun interrupted him. "Even if you try to sound cool, you're just a half-lich. You're not a real one. You nearly became one. A true Lich's mana density and focus are on a whole different level." "What? How dare you?" the boss roared. "You think such petty provocation will work on? Fool." The leader was stunned by how casually Soo-hyun insulted the dungeon boss. Enraged, the skeletal priest shouted, "I'll tear off your limbs and feed them to my beasts." He rose into the air and summoned an army of the dead. Soo-hyun had been right, the creature possessed only half its original power, yet it could still raise undead soldiers. That must have been why the dungeon had shifted to yellow difficulty. "Why are you provoking him? Don't do that," the leader yelled. But Soo-hyun had done it intentionally. It was the only way to make the boss attack first. The two readied their swords. Soo-hyun gripped his weapon and traced a glowing circle on the ground. A blue ring of light surrounded them both. He didn't want to tell the leader this, but right now, he wasn't strong enough to fight all these monsters at once. It would be difficult enough just protecting the leader. "The creatures won't be able to cross this circle," he said. "You just need to distract them without stepping outside it." As for Soo-hyun, his opponent was the skeletal boss itself. He leapt into the air with one great jump, charging straight at the boss. The boss dodged effortlessly. He was incredibly fast. It was teleportation. Normally, a lich doesn't fight physically. They use undead servants to mask their own weakness. Their fatal flaw is the life crystal embedded in their foreheads, the single gem that anchors their soul. They always keep their distance to protect it. Their teleportation ability was developed for that very reason, which also meant, if you could get close enough to grab it, you could end the fight instantly. Soo-hyun swung at the monster, but the boss kept slipping away. The creature's tattered cloak created blind spots, making him hard to track. Soo-hyun blocked an incoming spell and countered with his own attack, Divine Flame. He wasn't sure if it had landed. That skill could deal devastating damage, but it was useless if it didn't hit. "You thought you hurt me?" the boss mocked. "Pathetic. Hitting a moving target like me is impossible." For a moment, Soo-hyun's sword was stuck in the wall. "Watching him struggle like that is amusing," the monster sneered. "Better take a look at your blade first." The boss's magic corroded everything it touched. His weapon would dissolve in 5 minutes. "You've got about 5 minutes before you lose that sword," the boss said. "Then that's perfect," Soo-hyun replied, "because this will be over in 5 minutes. He tore his sword free and launched himself straight at the lich. The ground shook as he struck, smoke filling the chamber. The leader was terrified for Soo-hyun, but he hadn't come here to be protected. Still, if he tried anything now, he'd only get in the way. He didn't know what to do. Stepping outside the circle would mean instant death, but he couldn't just sit and do nothing. Gripping his weapon, he cut down one monster, then another, before finally stepping out of the circle to fight alongside him. Juho was holding his ground, slashing through monsters in bursts of blue fire, which shocked Soo-hyun completely. He could only watch in disbelief as the divine flame burned brighter than before. How was he even able to wield that kind of power now? But as Juho's aura flared, Soo-hyun realized what had changed. Juho's mana level had risen dramatically since entering the dungeon. Had he really grown this strong in such a short time? Incredible, Soo-hyun thought. If that's true, I need to change my plans. Just then, the skeleton demanded to know why Soo-hyun was running away. But in that same instant, Soo-hyun shredded the remaining undead into pieces. "I wasn't running," he said calmly. "I was just beginning to execute my plan." The skeleton was stunned, while Juho asked why he was moving toward him. But Soo-hyun didn't answer. He only said, "I owe you an apology for earlier. The one before me isn't weak. We'll need to finish off these creatures and then, together, face the skeleton." Encouraged by those words, Juho steadied himself, but the skeleton only laughed. "Do these fools really think the two of them can defeat me?" he bellowed. Of course, Juho doubted it too. Could anyone even attempt such a thing? But Soo-hyun shared his plan, and Juho nodded. "I trust your judgment," he said. "I'll try, not to drag you down." Then Soo-hyun shifted into his battle stance. The skeleton commanded his undead army to charge, unleashing them toward the two warriors. The air trembled as the heroes launched forward together. None of the monsters expected to be sent flying across the field in a single strike. Even the skeletal priest couldn't believe it. He was facing not a mere C rank, but a force that burned with divine fire. And as his attention turned toward Juho, Soo-hyun struck. The skeleton sneered, saying their double attack was an interesting idea, but warned them that it wouldn't work. At that moment, Juho closed his eyes, gripped his sword tempest with all his might, and unleashed his skill, Wind Dance. The two attacks merged together in perfect rhythm, something the skeletal priest couldn't comprehend. He never imagined two people could synchronize their strikes with such precision and grace. While he was still processing it, their combined assault had already hit. That was the moment the heroes realized it was time to unite their strength completely. After vaulting off Soo-hyun's sword, Ju-ho sprang forward toward the skeleton. The boss tried to shield himself, vowing he wouldn't fall for the same trick again. He thought his counterattack would land on Ju-ho, but what he didn't know was that, in that instant, Soo-hyun was already behind him, blade raised and ready. "This is the end for you, skeleton." Soo-hyun swung his sword only for it to shatter in half upon impact. The skeleton burst out laughing, ecstatic. "It seems you forgot. Boy, your sword was cursed. Now you're unarmed, and I will grind you to dust." But Soo-hyun just smiled. "Who said I'm the only one holding a sword?" The skeleton froze. Something was wrong. He turned and saw Ju-ho right behind him, his blade already in motion. In one clean strike, he severed the creature's head. The skull, along with the glowing crystal embedded in its forehead, cracked apart. The monster screamed in agony before collapsing lifelessly to the ground. Watching it all, Soo-hyun explained, "From the very start, the skeleton assumed I was using Ju-ho as bait. That's why he kept his focus on me. He thought he had the upper hand when my sword broke. But from the beginning, our plan was for Ju-ho to land the final blow. We knew he'd fall for it." The skeletal remains twitched weakly, its voice rasping through the dust. "You fools. Our king will return. This isn't over. The king will come for you all, and take everything precious from you." Then the light in its eyes faded. Ju-ho stared in disbelief. "Is it really over?" But Soo-hyun knew it was. Still, the monster's final words about their king lingered uneasily in his mind. By the time they emerged from the dungeon, both men were exhausted and confused about what to do next. They sat quietly in the bushes, watching rescue teams evacuate the others. One of the girls was asked about her missing teammate, and she began to cry, saying she only hoped he'd survived, but he was probably gone. Ju-ho looked on as well. "It seems Baron called for a rescue squad," he said, sounding uneasy. That could be bad news for both of them. Soo-hyun didn't want anyone to know what had really happened here, especially that he was the top-ranked awakened, the number one in the tower. Soo-hyun immediately grew tense. People would find out eventually, but he didn't want fame at least. Not now. Ju-ho stood up and said he'd go handle things himself. Soo-hyun was startled. "You're going alone?" "I'm good at these situations," Ju-ho replied calmly. "But I have one condition: the reward share still goes to you, not me." Soo-hyun was taken aback. The amount of ethereal stones they'd earned was worth hundreds of millions. "Are you sure about this?" he asked. But Ju-ho only smiled faintly. He didn't want the prize. "Your help was worth far more than what's in that bag," he said. "If I wanted to, I could have tried to handle the Lich alone. You let me fight beside you to grow stronger. That's reward enough." Soo-hyun chuckled. "I doubt it'll be that easy to fool me." But Ju-ho continued seriously. "Go as far away as you can while I take care of the rest." Then he made a call, arranging for a friend to drive Soo-hyun to safety. As Soo-hyun got into the car, he couldn't believe someone would risk so much just to escort him to safety. Still, he felt grateful they had caught the traitor, even if they couldn't save everyone. The only reason any of them had survived was because of Ju-ho's help. Without him, Soo-hyun wouldn't have been able to handle everything alone. He realized now that he wasn't as strong as he thought. He had to become far, far stronger to change the future he remembered, to gather trustworthy allies, and to protect the world properly. But before all that, he needed to take care of himself. "I'll start with something big," he thought, "and make some real money." By then, the engine started, and the road to his next trial had begun. A man approached the ethereal stone exchange officer and asked to meet him personally. He said there was someone trying to sell stones, though the seller was only a C-rank awakened. However, when the officer heard that this person had brought in over 500 grams of ethereal stone, he was utterly shocked. Naturally, the manager rushed straight to the counter where Soo-hyun sat waiting and apologized profusely for keeping him waiting. He'd heard the man had brought some ethereal stones, so Soo-hyun immediately handed them over. The manager began inspecting them carefully. "Stones of this quality," he said, "can only be found in yellow-level dungeons. Are you sure you acquired them legally?" That comment instantly irritated Soo-hyun. He asked what the man was implying. The manager quickly backtracked, saying he meant nothing by it. But as far as he knew, Soo-hyun was a C-rank awakened, so it was odd for him to possess stones that only appeared in higher-ranked dungeons. It was clear the manager was trying to lower the price by casting doubt on their authenticity. So, Soo-hyun smiled faintly and said he'd been lucky to earn a special reward from a dungeon. Then he reached into his pocket and placed something on the table, an ethereal stone of the highest grade. It was the Lich's life crystal. Not many people knew about it, but it counted as an ethereal stone too. Destroying it was the only way to kill a Lich, but the drop rate was incredibly low. Even Soo-hyun hadn't expected to get that lucky. Of course, he used that fact to his advantage. He calmly said that if they doubted him, he'd simply take his stones elsewhere. The manager panicked, trying to stop him. He thought he'd managed to grab the crystal, but when he looked down, it was gone. Soo-hyun was already walking toward the door, saying he'd hear everyone's best offer once and only once. The room fell silent. Moments later, we see Soo-hyun walking down the street, having just sold the crystal for a massive sum, earning 600 million won for one stone. Now that was a good deal. Still, he thought, when disaster strikes, money won't mean much. For now though, he needed it because in the near future, he'd definitely require funds. By then, Soo-hyun had already returned home, but he noticed something strange. His mother had a faint scar across her face. It shocked him. He immediately asked how she'd gotten hurt. His mother waved it off, telling him not to worry. It happened at the restaurant where she worked. She'd been separating two drunk customers during a fight. Of course, Soo-hyun lost his temper right away. Why was she still working there? Why risk herself like that? But his mother didn't understand why he was so upset. To her, he was about to enter university, which meant tuition fees were coming. She wanted him to have every opportunity in life, something she could be proud of. Soo-hyun froze for a moment. Memories flashed back: his mother, scolding him for not trying hard enough, people telling him he had to become a hero. When he came back to himself, she was looking at him with concern, asking if everything was okay. He said there was something he needed to tell her. They sat down at the table, and Soo-hyun confessed he wasn't awakened. His mother blinked in surprise. Like the people on TV? She asked. Soo-hyun nodded. He explained that awakened individuals were respected in society, and that he could make enough money doing this instead of going to college. He apologized for not telling her sooner, but he didn't want to hide it anymore. His mother interrupted him gently. Do you really want to do this not for the money, not for the fame, but because you want it? Remembering what the world would soon face, Soo-hyun answered without hesitation. Yes, he did. She sighed softly, then smiled, saying she understood and accepted his decision. He asked if she was angry at him for hiding it for more than a year, especially since it was such a dangerous job. He expected a scolding, but instead, she told him that of course she worried about him, but now she finally understood why she'd never been able to wake him up when he was deep in those long sleeps. She didn't want to force him into a life he didn't want. All she wanted was for her son to make his own choices and be happy. But from now on, she asked him to tell her everything that bothered him, never to hide anything again. Soo-hyun smiled and promised he would, thanking her sincerely. Then his phone buzzed. He showed her the message. It was proof of his earnings. He'd already made enough money for her to quit her job entirely. His mother leaned closer to look at the screen and froze in shock. She couldn't believe it. They were rich. Richer than she could have imagined in such a short time. Of course, this was just the beginning. Soo-hyun asked his mother if she was happy. In response, she tossed the phone back into his hands with a smile and said she was overjoyed she'd even prepare a special dinner to celebrate. Watching her, Soo-hyun realized that this very moment was what he had always wanted in life. He simply wanted moments that felt this warm, this peaceful. For a fleeting second, he even thought about giving everything up and just living quietly. But deep down, he knew he wasn't the real Soo-hyun who should be living this life. This warmth belonged to the true Soo-hyun. Still, it didn't matter right now. He had been given a second chance to protect this world. When the real Soo-hyun returned to this body someday, he wanted him to have a world and a mother, still safe to come home to. That's why he would become the hero himself. But first, he had to get stronger because he was still weak. Even the Lich had given him trouble. Now, he needed to keep climbing the tower, again and again. To do that, he needed a weapon, not the cheap, mass-produced kind provided by the authorities, but a real one. There was only one man who could help him with that, the human blacksmith, Kim Dae-ho. Not long after, Soo-hyun stood outside Dae-ho's workshop, knocking firmly and interrupting the man's work. When Dae-ho opened the door, Soo-hyun blocked his way, smiling brightly. "It's an honor to finally meet you," he said. We see then the legendary weapon Balmung, the holy sword that slew dragons. It was the same sword the previous Soo-hyun had once wielded, back when he was still called Sunjin, the greatest blade ever forged from countless rare materials, and the combined effort of awakened craftsmen and its creator was none other than Kim Dae-ho. Once, in a rainstorm, Soo-hyun had come to the blacksmith's forge and asked if the commission he'd ordered was ready. Dae-ho proudly presented the sword. It gleamed magnificently, his life's greatest masterpiece. But to his surprise, Soo-hyun refused to accept it. He said he understood the struggle Dae-ho had endured in making it, and that the rarest materials in existence had been spent for this creation. "How could someone like me dare to take it?" he said. He hadn't even paid Dae-ho for his work. How could he accept such a treasure? The blacksmith insisted he listen. He said he'd heard the rumors that the world now called Sunjin the hero, and while fame could easily inflate a man's pride, he saw something different in Sunjin. "The stronger your name grows," Dae-ho said, "the heavier the burden people place on you. They all expect too much, and that confusion can break anyone." Yet, despite it all, Sunjin kept pushing forward, trying to meet those expectations. That was why Dae-ho wanted to gift him the sword freely, because Sunjin was the only one worthy of wielding something born of pure craftsmanship and sacrifice. Dae-ho was a savior in his own way, a craftsman who saved others with his work. perhaps even the one who once saved Sungin's life. And in his previous life, Sungin hadn't been able to protect him. It had been far too long since Dae-ho had last seen Sungin, but this time, Soo-hyun silently promised himself he would protect him. Dae-ho, however, didn't recognize him standing before him now. "How'd you even find this place?" he asked. Soo-hyun just said he'd heard this was the best smith who made weapons for Awakened. Dae-ho immediately yelled, "That's not true," and slammed the door shut. Soo-hyun chuckled the man hadn't changed a bit. Then he called out that he had brought materials with him. The door opened again. "Well, since you've brought something worth seeing, I might as well take a look," Dae-ho muttered. Soo-hyun placed the materials before him, and Dae-ho's eyes widened in disbelief. In his hands was a high-grade ethereal stone, one of the rarest materials in existence. It was another reward Soo-hyun had received after slaying the Lich. People believed this item was impossible to obtain. It was only after the Gwangju dungeon break that the world learned a top-grade ethereal stone could be acquired as a dungeon reward. That's why Soo-hyun had already decided he would have to conquer the Gwangju dungeon himself one day. Ethereal stones had countless uses, but their greatest value lay in weapon crafting. "Where did a kid like you even get this?" Dae-ho muttered. Soo-hyun simply said it wasn't something he needed to worry about. "So," the blacksmith asked, "what does our hero want me to make from these?" "I need a greatsword," Soo-hyun answered. Dae-ho led him inside, grinning. "Looks like I've found the right man. With materials like these, I won't even need to charge you." He began talking about drawing up a contract, but Soo-hyun shook his head. "No need for that." The blacksmith stared at him in disbelief. Did this boy not realize the value of what he was handing over? But Soo-hyun said calmly, "I trust you," because he knew Dae-ho's true passion lay not in owning weapons, but in creating dreams from the heart of an ethereal stone. The blacksmith burst out laughing, calling Soo-hyun a remarkable young man. He said he liked everything about this situation and that he'd gladly take the commission. A weapon this extraordinary deserves the greatest sword ever forged. Soo-hyun immediately thanked the master craftsman and shook his hand. Of course, Dae-ho explained that creating such a sword would take time, and that Soo-hyun could borrow any weapon from the workshop in the meantime. When Soo-hyun finally stepped out of the forge, he carried with him a temporary blade displayed in the center of the shop. He knew it was time to get back on the road. Or rather, back to the tower. From there, Soo-hyun's journey continued. He passed the old gatekeeper again, climbing through the 11th floor, the 12th, the 13th one, after another. Each time, he faced new monsters, rising in rank and earning rewards for his battles. 6 months later, we see one of his former companions, the same girl who had once fought beside him in a dungeon talking to Juho. No one had expected his recovery to take this long, nor that he'd challenge himself by raising the difficulty to level 5. "What happens if the dungeon gets even stronger?" she asked. Juho simply replied, "If I start pitying myself, I'll never be able to catch up to him," meaning Soo-hyun. Just then, Juho's phone rang. It startled him. It was Soo-hyun. If nothing was wrong, Soo-hyun said, he wanted to ask 3 favors. First, find a good apartment near Seoul. Since he'd given up the magic shop, he needed a new place to move into. Second, gather information about the Dumps Guild. Kim Yoon must have been one of their lowest-ranking members, but her death without completing her mission would certainly raise suspicion within the guild. Tracking them down would be difficult, but not impossible. Soo-hyun knew it was better not to get tangled in that mess yet, and Juho assured him he'd handle it. Soo-hyun thanked him, then mentioned his third request. Third, on November 24, there would be a massive monster outbreak in Anyang with as many as 10,000 casualties. Juho was stunned. How could Soo-hyun possibly know that? As expected, Soo-hyun didn't explain. He just said he could tell him everything now, because he needed someone who would believe him. The two smiled, acknowledging the trust between them. Helping with the outbreak was his third favor. There were less than 6 months until Christmas time was short. Soo-hyun knew he had to become much stronger. Soon, he'd have the weapon Dae-ho was crafting, and after clearing the 20th floor, he'd have to face the outbreak event. But before that, he needed to conquer the 19th floor perfectly. The entrance to the 19th floor opened before him. A vast desert stretched out, littered with skeletal remains and crawling with rodents. The mission: survive and escape. The creatures were countless. The moment Soo-hyun landed, he saw the rats gnawing at the remains of some fallen beast. He knew immediately he'd be their next target. As they surged forward, the battle began. The rats were small, quick, and vicious, hurling themselves at him. The only way to counter that swarm was with one spell: Divine Flame. He unleashed it at once, incinerating the horde in an instant. But as he looked closer, he noticed some of the rats climbing over the skeletons charging straight toward him again. He had no choice but to fend them off physically. More and more came, and then he saw a crack forming in the ground. Maybe, just maybe, he could use it. He hurled his sword directly into the fissure, collapsing the ground beneath the rats. It worked. The surface caved in, swallowing them all. When the dust settled, Soo-hyun found himself inside what looked like an ancient temple. This must have been the real trial. He glanced at one surviving rat. It was trembling uncontrollably. What was it so afraid of? Then, suddenly, the rats scattered in panic. one of them stepped on a pressure plate, and with a flash of light, the thorns pierced his flesh. That's when Soo-hyun realized he was right. This was where the true guardian of the test appeared. A colossal serpent emerged from the shadows, striking at him immediately. Soo-hyun countered with his first blow, but it barely left a scratch. Even his spirit sword, superior to any normal weapon, failed to pierce its scales. He quickly switched to magic, chanting Divine Flame again, but the serpent didn't flinch. The spell was useless. Its resistance to magic was overwhelming. So this was it, a beast immune to both physical and magical damage. The serpent lunged, tail sweeping in a feint before snapping its jaws at him. Soo-hyun jammed his sword into its mouth to block the bite. But the below impact sent him flying. On the surface, the creature seemed invincible, but if this had been a month ago, he wouldn't have stood a chance. Now, though, he had everything he needed to win. The serpent hissed in fury, coiling to strike again, and Soo-hyun braced himself. The real fight had only just begun. Soo-hyun realized he only had about half his usual mana left after a standard battle, so before draining it completely, he had to immobilize the serpent. He leapt into the air, striking down with lightning-like precision, then vaulted away. As he soared upward, he noticed vines covering the ceiling, perfect for gripping and repositioning himself repeatedly. Soo-hyun thought, no matter how powerful my magic is, all I have to do is hit the right spot. At that moment, he landed a precise blow. The serpent shrieked in agony. It was clear it had been hurt. Seizing the moment, Soo-hyun launched an attack aimed at its abdomen. His strike landed. The serpent screamed again, but there was little effect. The monster immediately lunged toward him at full speed. Strangely, Soo-hyun was smiling. Just before impact, the serpent froze midair. He had used the vines to bind it in place. This creature was powerful, resistant to almost everything, with immense regeneration. But Soo-hyun knew one thing for sure. It couldn't win. He had more strength than it did now. Channeling his energy, he invoked Divine Fire to summon a phoenix, a skill he'd acquired on the 18th floor when his Divine Flame evolved. It wasn't a simple spell. It allowed him to summon and command a mythical beast. The drawback was, its mana cost it consumed far more than expected, but the destructive power was 10 times greater than the original Divine Flame. Soo-hyun gave the order, and the phoenix soared into the air, slamming through the serpent's neck in one blazing strike. The battle was over. The 19th floor had been cleared. Everyone knew that the tower's difficulty spiked every 10 floors. Just like the 10th floor before, the 20th would be another brutal challenge. Over the past 6 months, Soo-hyun had done everything to prepare, but now only one thing remained: Daeho's sword. By this time, people across the city were talking about Soo-hyun again. Many doubted if he was even real. How could someone like that get all these opportunities while ignoring every attempt by the association to contact him? They wondered. Does anyone even know who he really is? Meanwhile, Joo-ho sat nervously in a cafe, waiting. A few moments later, a car pulled up outside. Soo-hyun stepped out. Soo-hyun apologized for being late, and Joo-ho immediately asked if he liked the car he'd given him. Soo-hyun admitted that it was incredible, so much so that it turned heads everywhere he went. But Joo-ho didn't see the problem. He was just proud that Soo-hyun was using it. Inside the cafe, Joo-ho asked if he was ready for the 20th floor. Soo-hyun replied that everything was set, except for one thing he'd been putting off, but he'd finally receive it today. He also thanked Joo-ho for checking in on his mother's restaurant. Their conversation soon turned serious. They discussed potential monster outbreaks across the cities. Joo-ho mentioned he had arranged a meeting with a major agency director next month, which could help spread awareness about Soo-hyun's warnings. Soo-hyun realized that if the meeting happened next month, that would leave roughly 2 months until the next outbreak. Then he asked the first question that truly mattered. What about the dumps? Joo-ho hesitated, then said he'd asked around, but no one had any answers. It seemed the guild was in hiding. However, he had discovered that both the death rate and the number of missing awakened had recently increased due to the sudden rise in dungeon difficulty. There wasn't much more to go on. Still, he'd found 2 cases where awakened were found dead in the streets. Upon investigation, it turned out they'd been poisoned. A flash of realization struck Soo-hyun. He urged Joo-ho to tell him everything. Joo-ho agreed, and they discussed the details deep into the evening. By the time Soo-hyun left, the sun had already set. Walking through the quiet streets, he counted down the days until that event. He appreciated Joo-ho's effort, but so far, nothing concrete had surfaced. It was clear now he'd have to take matters into his own hands. Soon after, Soo-hyun's car stopped in front of Daeho's forge. He stood there for a moment, admiring the weapon displays through the glass. Then he heard the door open, and Daeho greeted him, apologizing for the delay. It took longer than expected to handle something this extraordinary, the blacksmith said, but I truly enjoyed working on it. He promised that the sword's full power was ready to be tested. When Soo-hyun unsheathed it, he froze. It didn't feel like an ordinary weapon. It breathed. Even before holding it properly, he could sense life emanating from it. He swung it lightly through the air. Its edge and balance were flawless. The blade didn't just respond to his mana, it understood it, knowing what to cut and what to spare. It was, without a doubt, a masterpiece. Daeho asked if Soo-hyun had thought of a name for his sword. After all, he said, it's yours now, it deserves a name. Soo-hyun paused for a moment, then nodded. Then I'll call it Graham. Graham the Dragon Slayer. Dae-ho blinked in surprise. Graham? You mean like gramophone? Soo-hyun laughed lightly and explained that Graham was actually another name for Balmung in Northern Europe. He couldn't bring himself to name it Balmung again, and he certainly didn't want a title that meant Godslayer. As they talked, Dae-ho asked when such a fine customer would visit again and offered him tea, but Soo-hyun smiled and said he still had much to do. He promised to return next time when he had more time to spare. At that moment, the story's perspective shifted far away, in another world, to a kingdom, or rather, a fortress. We see a man approaching the gate guard, asking how things were going. It's going well, Captain Maxman, the guard replied. Captain Maxman said, under normal conditions, we just need to hold out a little longer. But if the Udrum kingdom invades, the fortress will be in real danger. Maxman immediately ordered to the knight strengthen surveillance. Still, he understood times were changing, and so was everything within the kingdom. While Maxman pondered the situation, another man approached from behind and said, a lot in your mind, Sir Maxman. Maximin froze in surprise and said, what are you doing here, Sir Retainer? Weren't you sent to assist His Royal Highness? The retainer replied that he was there to ensure the defenses were properly manned. How are the troops holding up? He was told the forces were concentrated at the castle walls, but the situation wasn't looking good. His army vastly outnumbered theirs. Retainer told him to wait, asking whether the Maxman was suggesting they abandon the fortress. The Maxman stepped back, clarifying that he only meant it would be wise to plan for emergencies, because if the siege dragged on, the supply lines would break. But Retainer snapped, saying, there's no need for that. Better for us all to die than surrender this fortress. The Maxman fell silent, stunned. He couldn't believe the man before him would say such a thing. Why would he willingly sacrifice his soldiers' lives? Since the declaration of war, this same man, one of the king's top lieutenants, had been made commander-in-chief. Blind obedience might be a soldier's duty, but treating men like disposable ants was unforgivable. How could the king trust someone like him? As the Maxman struggled with his thoughts, Retainer patted his shoulder. In any case, we only need to hold for 1 month. That's what the king ordered. The words made his blood boil. The Maxman clenched his fists, then finally shouted that even if their positions were confirmed, nothing would change. Just then, a deafening explosion echoed across the fortress. The Maxman cried out, demanding to know what had happened. A soldier rushed up, yelling that they were under attack. A few hours earlier, at the gate of the 20th floor, stood the guardian once again. The gatekeeper looked at Soo-hyun and said, it's rare to see a man this wealthy. Are you here to ask for advice? Soo-hyun asked what the issue was, and the gatekeeper replied that if the price was right, he'd be happy to share. The higher the floor, the harder it was to bribe the gatekeeper, and this time, Soo-hyun laid down an astounding 10 million points. The man could hardly believe his eyes. Ordinary challengers would need 10 years to save up that much, he said. You really are rich. But where are you headed exactly? I want to try the maximum difficulty level 10, Soo-hyun answered. What should I be careful of? The gatekeeper grinned. No need to worry. Just remember, kill whomever you must. That's your advice. There's no one better suited than you for that task. Just make sure you're certain about what you're doing. And with that, he pushed Soo-hyun straight through the gate. Soo-hyun sighed. Annoyed, every gatekeeper talked in riddles. Then the fall began. Soo-hyun caught a branch midair and finally saw what awaited him. An enormous kingdom. The system's voice rang out. You have entered the 20th floor. Difficulty level 10. Before him stood the great fortress of the Grandalum Kingdom, a stronghold of iron walls and 1,000 soldiers. The mission, capture the fortress. However, Soo-hyun wasn't their enemy. This was a trial. He could even save allies if he played it right. The objective was to uncover every secret within the dungeon. The explanation was long, but Soo-hyun had learned one thing. The longer the description, the greater the rewards. The gatekeeper's words echoed faintly in his mind. You shouldn't kill anyone if you can help it, and he thought, but how do you conquer a fortress without fighting? Night fell quickly. Soo-hyun observed the battlefield. The iron walls were impossibly thick, and the soldiers' strength was impressive. Many were capable of using real magic. The situation was grim. He was outnumbered and outmatched. He had 1 month to complete this trial, but little room to maneuver. And so, with the fortress looming under a blood-red sunset, Soo-hyun's next great challenge began. After lying on the grass for a while, he realized and decided it was time to act. He immediately stood in front of the guards and decided to confront them all. Soo-hyun told the gathered guards right away that he was merely a traveler, so he asked to stay in the castle for a while. The guards, of course, couldn't believe it. Was he really insane? Didn't he see they weren't in a very good position? But Soo-hyun only thought about the Anyang outbreak being 2 months away, so it was worth overcoming every trial difficulty as quickly as possible. Therefore, if the guards wouldn't let him in, he would use his power. At the same moment, he rose into the air and smashed through the castle gates, surprising everyone. Everyone was stunned, and Maxman saw him attacking. People shouted that this was an invader or something, but Soo-hyun looked only at the sword and realized the blade in his hand was actually a famous sword, because he could harmonize with it and feel its edge freely. Many guards tried to seize the bastard by then, so Soo-hyun had to fight all the guards. He knew the sword was unbelievably sharp, but at the same time, it could not cut anything against its master's will. Many guards checked their wounds and called for reinforcements. Arrows were fired at Soo-hyun's body repeatedly, but they were cut in half. One man had to be thrown off the bridge to silence him. However, when Soo-hyun looked the other way, he noticed that the marksman was already ready to charge into battle, but the soldiers restrained him. They said the commander could not simply rush into battle or the entire operation would collapse. Soo-hyun realized this was the commander that many people placed him above their own lives, trying to obey his orders. Even though he led them, they didn't disobey and prioritized his protection. Of course, to draw out the situation, Soo-hyun made a little noise so attacking the commander would accelerate everything. Once Soo-hyun was in the air, the knights immediately stopped him with ropes. Soo-hyun, of course, managed to halt the entire assault, which astonished them, then entered into combat with the marksman. After only a few seconds, he realized the man before him was strong. The two began to fight, but the guards couldn't tell whether their leader was okay. The commander started issuing orders, saying he would be Soo-hyun's opponent, while all soldiers stood to defend the fortress. However, he was certain the man before him was not a spy of the kingdom. He judged this from his opponent's will. Soo-hyun could only smile because his enemy truly possessed excellent judgment skill as expected, and the commander certainly deserved that. At the same time, the guards began to support their leader, claiming he had led them to victory 20 years ago, so if he participated in this battle, everything would be fine. Of course, Soo-hyun realized that everyone probably trusted and believed in their commander, but they definitely didn't understand that this belief was nothing more than shackles on a person's feet, just like the restraints that bound Soo-hyun's feet when he was a hero. Simultaneously, Soo-hyun stood and apologized profusely for having to open the gate without permission, but said he definitely had serious business to attend to. The commander retorted that everything Soo-hyun said was nonsense, because there were customary laws in their kingdom, and certainly no one should be allowed to enter at such a time. Soo-hyun immediately said that if that was the case, he would commit the crime again. In truth, Soo-hyun's idea was to seize the castle without bloodshed, to convince the person who enjoyed the greatest trust in this fortress. The commander couldn't figure out who Soo-hyun really was. However, once the commander regained a bit of awareness, he noticed that Soo-hyun had tied his hand with a rope he'd obtained earlier. Soo-hyun wasted no time. At the same moment, he used a powerful skill and struck the target. The guards immediately began to worry.